Today we're very happy to have what I think is the 5th installment in our Food Security Symposium series that Elizabeth and Zachary Nelson have been supporting. And today we're really thrilled to have Chris Barrett here. Chris is actually here on sabbatical this quarter, so he's been here for a while. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about him because if I told you everything about him, we'd run out of time. But the first thing I've learned about Chris is that he actually started out as a lacrosse player at Princeton, where his wife Clara, who's here, was also an athlete and a student. And he still, I think, says she was a better athlete and a better student, and still is. But luckily, he decided to forego the lacrosse career, and he's focused on his academic work, which has been really, it's hard to really put into words the impact he's had on his field. He's been a leading scholar in so many different issues, among them poverty traps, food aid, supply chains and smallholder systems, resilience, risk management, and a lot of methods development. He's also somehow done a tremendous amount of service, which is sort of mind-bogglingly. He's been Dean of Academic Affairs. He was directed the School of Applied Econ and Management at Cornell. He's an editor of Food Policy, one of the leading journals. He's the lead editor on a series of books around food security and agricultural economics. So my goal for this sabbatical, actually, my selfish reason for inviting Chris here was to try to pry open the secret of how he manages to do all this administrative stuff, which I seem to not be able to do with and also sustain the productivity and the scholarship. So I have about a month left. I'm still working on it. But today we'll focus on the scholarly aspects, and really looking forward to this. So the way we will structure this is Chris will give his remarks for 50 minutes or so. I'll begin a Q&A, but we'll have plenty of time for the audience, starting with the students to ask questions. And then around 5 o'clock or so, we'll adjourn to the lobby for a reception for a while. So with those remarks, let me just thank again Chris for coming and welcome him to the stage.
Thanks very much, David. It's very kind of you to introduce me so generously, and thank you all for taking time. Winning out over a day like this on the peninsula is my biggest win. So if you all go home in another 15 minutes, I'll feel like I did pretty well to have actually drawn you out of the sunshine. You have to appreciate that coming from Ithaca, we don't expect to see blue skies in February, so this is a real treat. I thought that sitting in Silicon Valley, it would be especially appropriate to talk about innovation. But at a talk hosted by the Center on Food Security and the Environment, I obviously need to talk about food security, which is near and dear to my heart anyway. So I'm going to try to explain to you my current thinking about what are the innovations we need looking forward to address the challenges that the world faces in global food security. And the first question to answer is, why should we care? I'd like to think I don't need to make a sales pitch to a self-selected audience, but just in case anybody isn't quite so sure, they were really looking for a different, like a Hoover Institution talk and aren't quite sure how they wound up in this room. The primary reason I would argue is a basic human rights reason. That enshrined in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the human right to food. And that has been drawn out through a whole sequence of different global meetings. The most popular definition of food security is the one you see before you that comes from a 1996 summit. But the crucial parts of it are the ones I underlined. All people at all times, sufficient, safe, and nutritious food for an active and healthy life. There are all sorts of permutations of this floating around, but the key parts here are all times, all people, and health. So I would argue that the primary reason to care about food security is it's an intrinsic human right. It's essential to human flourishing. But for those of you who aren't convinced by that, there are instrumental reasons too. Food security is really central to maintaining political stability. This is where we really should be over at the Hoover Institution, I guess. So the book cover you see in front of you was a book that I pulled together with a group of colleagues around how food security influences socio-political instability. And that was sparked by an interest that the US intelligence community had after 2011, when they realized there were bread riots all over the world and governments were being overthrown in Haiti and Madagascar and other places. And this was all somehow associated with disruptions in food systems. And the US intelligence community no longer had any capacity to analyze any of this. So they didn't understand what was happening and why. So they asked for a group of scholars to come together to think about the relationship. So even a bunch of spooks will care about food security, even if they might not always have first-order respect for human rights issues. But there are also environmental reasons that I suspect some of you care about deeply. The primary reason for conversion of forest in sub-Saharan Africa is smallholder agriculture. You see an example here of a photo I took a few years ago in Madagascar, and places like the coast of Ghana, where I took this other picture, are heavily overfished, largely because of anthropogenic pressures. People trying to feed themselves naturally draw down natural capital. That can have perilous consequences for future generations. So there are some instrumental reasons, not just intrinsic reasons, to care about food security. Now, the core of my argument is going to be that we have to have a progressive agenda if we're going to tackle food security in a systematic, sensible, and ultimately effective way. And by that, I mean progressive in two different senses of the term. The first is having faith in the progress that comes from science and technology. The progress that we have made to date, and one of the centerpieces of my argument in a moment will be, we should be optimistic. We have confronted massive global food security challenges before and prevailed. But the challenges today are different. We prevailed in that last wave, the last 50 years, largely by trusting in science and technology to help us to expand the supply of nutrients available per capita in ways that accelerated poverty reduction, helped to address a multitude of problems, and had a bunch of unintended consequences. Now it's time for us to address the new wave of challenges. So the first part of progressivity is a faith in science and technology as an engine for progress. I'd like to think I don't have to make that case too hard at a place like Stanford. Likewise, Cornell is a pretty hospitable environment for that. There are other places not so much. But the second is solidarity with the poor, or a preferential option for the poor. That food security at all times for all peoples ultimately requires we pay attention first and foremost to people who struggle to feed their families adequately in a way that, I'm going to hazard the guess, you and I don't. We're fortunately able to take care of our families. And so it requires coupling science with a solidarity with the poor that sometimes gets lost. Sometimes we fixate on the science. Occasionally people fixate on solidarity with the poor, but we need to walk on both of those legs at the same time. So the two central messages of my talk will be, the challenges we face are formidable. I in no way wish to minimize the really serious problems we face in staying within planetary boundaries as we aspire to feed a global population of 10 to 11 billion people 50 years from now. That's not a simple task. Moreover, there are lots of reasons to think our food system is driving us to really serious health problems. Obesity rates are increasing very rapidly. Non-communicable diseases associated with bad diets are the leading cause of death in the world today. So there are problems, but we have tackled food security challenges before effectively, so I have faith we can do it again. And I want to explain briefly why I have faith in that. But the second and most importantly, and what I'll spend most of the time on, is the challenges today are fundamentally different. They're different in place, they're different in nature, and they're different in how we have to tackle these as a society. The essence of these can be summarized in the 6 points you see here. We need to focus pretty intently on Africa, to a lesser degree on South Asia. We really need to focus on healthy diets, micronutrients and obesity in particular, much less on undernutrition. Adequate calories is a problem for a subpopulation, not a problem best tackled through the food system any longer, for reasons I'll explain. We need to de-risk agri-food systems. Risks are increasing, and the risk that people face is a really serious barrier to solutions. We are seeing and need to accelerate de-agrarianization of the food system. I'll explain that mouthful of a term in just a little bit. We need to pay much closer attention to planetary boundaries. And most importantly, as much as I want to emphasize science and technology, it's ultimately about policies and institutions and culture. Any number of great scientific approaches, wonderful technologies exist on the shelf, unadopted, undiffused, for pretty basic cultural, social, political reasons. And if we don't get the policies to match the science and technology, we'll fail. So the first basic point, we've succeeded at this task before. Just we imagined a different task. 50 years ago, especially sitting on this campus where you had scholars like Paul Ehrlich writing about the population bomb, people were really worried that global populations were growing very fast. We were seeing recurring famines around the world, Ethiopia, India, China. Famine was a fairly common phenomenon, recurring once a decade, essentially, since the 17th, 18th century. And people were very worried about a Malthusian process of population growth outstripping the capacity of the agricultural system to provide for human population growth, and we'd start to see more frequent and more severe famines. So the goal was, in the words of the original chair of the CGIAR, the International Agricultural Research System falls under an acronym, CGIAR. The original chair of the CGIAR board referred to it as growing the pile of rice on the plates of food-short consumers. That was their task. It was to increase the supply of calories, dietary energy, available per person so that people wouldn't go hungry. It was a pretty simple objective. Simple in the sense of very clear in purpose, not simple in a scientific sense. But it was one that got tackled quite effectively. 50 years ago this year, in 1970, Norman Borlaug, a wheat breeder, won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in developing improved varieties of wheat and the methods that then got ported over to other staple cereals crops for accelerating productivity growth in basic staples. Like you see a picture here of IR8, the flagship commodity new variety of rice, semi-dwarf rice developed at IRRI, the International Rice Research Institute, from its two parent lines that are right alongside it. So IRRI, many people think of as the technology that saved the most people in human history, because rice productivity growth, the knock-on effects in food markets and labor markets, especially in Southeast Asia, had huge implications for reducing poverty, reducing malnutrition, et cetera. So this has been done before through scientific discovery, largely in the form of the Green Revolution technologies around improved plant and animal genetics, accompanied by better mechanical inputs, better chemical inputs, and improved irrigation. The success here is undeniable. You can see in this plot the per capita, and I emphasize per capita, calorie supply steadily increasing over time. On the far right, you see a band. People can argue over what's the kind of minimum daily energy requirement for humans. It depends on stature, activity level, all these sorts of things. But no matter what measure you want to use, the availability per capita in every region of the world today, indeed for the last 15 years or so, easily exceeds what we need. There's a big distributional issue. That's not to say that there aren't people who don't get enough calories. There most certainly are. But it's not a matter of there not being enough food. It's a matter of it not being distributed well enough. And in case you're worried that it's not just about energy, you think protein is a different thing, calories and protein pretty much move in lockstep. The same description holds when we think of protein available per person. So we saw a problem of macronutrient availability, basic energy and protein availability that people feared was going to result in famines. This would have geopolitical implications during the Cold War. And the global scientific community was put to the task of address this problem, and it succeeded. The results are absolutely fabulous when you think hard about it. Today, we feed every day 5 billion people more an adequate energy intake. I emphasize only energy here. I'm not talking about minerals and vitamins yet, but an adequate energy intake, 5 billion more people than we did 50 years ago. That's an annual average of 90 million people extra given enough calories every night when they go to bed. If you don't think that's a remarkable accomplishment, I encourage you to think about that for a little while. That is an absolutely astounding, sustained rate of progress. We often think about what's the number of people who are hungry. It's way too big. 800 and some million people consistently is the FAO estimate over the last several years. Far too large a number. What we often fail to think about is what's the number that are getting enough? And the rate of growth of that has been astounding. I'll argue the reasons for the 800 and some million who still don't get enough dietary energy intake any given day are not about the food system anymore. That we need to move that task to a different part of societal tasks. And that accomplishment in growing agricultural productivity, the supply of essential macronutrients available per person per day has gone hand in hand with massive poverty reduction. I won't go into all the mechanisms by which what we economists refer to as the structural transformation takes place. The idea that as agricultural technologies become more efficient, farmers can release labor, their own demand, because their incomes are increasing, their own demand grows for non-farm services, which has a knock-on favorable effect in labor markets and in the demand for other non-food goods. And this has a big stimulus effect for the whole economy, lifting lots of people, farmers, farm workers, and others, out of poverty rapidly. We see exactly the same thing has happened in poverty reduction as we've seen in hunger reduction, that we have doubled the number of people who are non-poor, who are above the ridiculously low $1.90 a day per person extreme poverty line the World Bank sets, but we've doubled that number in a generation. That too should give you pause, that's an amazing accomplishment, that we've gone from 3.4 billion to about 6.6 billion people who have a standard of living above that line. That is not all science and technology, let me emphasize. A lot of that is policy reforms. It's things like the government of China dramatically changing how it controlled farmland and food markets. And in those transformations that Scott could describe far better than I ever could, in those transformations, unleashing 1 billion people who became incredibly productive and enjoyed a rate of economic growth unseen in recorded human history. But the fact of the matter remains that agricultural transformation has been very closely bound up with incredibly rapid poverty reduction. And these are things to celebrate. When we put our minds to the task and ignite the innovative cycles, we can succeed. I emphasize again, it's more than technology. The opening sentences of Amartya Sen's classic book, Poverties and Famines, for those who don't know him, Sen won the Nobel Prize in Economics, so 15 years ago or something like that. One of the greatest living thinkers in economics and philosophy, for that matter. And his opening lines from that sentence, with the emphasis being his in the original, bear direct quote. Starvation is the characteristic of some people not having enough food to eat. It is not the characteristic of there being not enough food to eat. That is to say, it's not just the supply side. The supply side matters. That's kind of the first necessary condition. If there's not enough supply to go around, we can't possibly hope that the relatively powerless, the poor, are ever going to get enough. But just having enough around isn't satisfactory. We have to ensure people have reliable access to an adequate diet. And that's where safety net programs and social protection programs become so essential. And the often unheralded and under-remarked part of the story of the agricultural transformation of the last half century is the rise of social protection programs. So we now have about 130 low and middle income countries that provide cash transfer programs to the poor, non-contributory programs, not things like the Social Security program in this country where we pay in and then we're entitled to payouts later. Just by being a resident, and in many countries it's just a resident, not a citizen, by being a resident, you are entitled to a payment intended to ensure you have some really minimal standard of living, and these are often exceedingly minimal transfers, but there's something. It provides you with a floor. Some countries do better yet. India has now enshrined as a constitutional right to work. Through the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, every Indian resident has an entitlement to 100 days of paid labor by government. So if your local rural village suffers a bad drought, the farming labor all dries up, no farmers are hiring anybody, and there's no place around that's willing to hire you, you can go to government and you have entitlement to 100 days of paid labor. That's nothing anyone aspires to. Those wage rates are low. You're not going to get rich off of this, but you can survive off of it. So there are a variety of mechanisms people can use. We have about 1.5 billion people right now who are beneficiaries of direct food assistance programs. And that whole system, especially the global system, David mentioned food aid programs. Food aid is kind of an antiquated term now. It's food assistance because there's very little of the old-fashioned procure wheat in North Dakota, bundle it up, send it down the Mississippi, put it on a ship, and send it halfway around the world. That is about 30% of the world's food assistance now. And most of it's actually targeted just to keep a pipeline flowing where it's a reasonably cost-effective device. That wasn't true 20 years ago. So the professionalization of the support systems for poor people is a really central piece of what has succeeded in ensuring adequate dietary energy supply and sharp reductions in extreme poverty around the world over the last half century. The problem is we've now taken that for granted. The rate of reduction of agricultural R&D expenditures around the world is distressingly uniform in how fast it has fallen. You just look at these graphics showing you, well, Sub-Saharan Africa, it hasn't fallen too much because it was always terribly low. But when you look at these other regions, these numbers are slightly out of date, but they're largely borne out if you go back and adjust for the price spikes of 2008 to 2011 when there was a bit of a blip. Agricultural R&D investment is largely fallen off the table, public R&D and philanthropic R&D investments. And this is a problem because food systems are naturally adaptive. Pests, pathogens are constantly changing. We constantly have to update the varieties cultivated. We have to constantly improve the genetic material in live domesticated animals and livestock just to keep up with the natural changes in the agroecosystems. So this is a treadmill problem. If you stop moving forward, you are going to go backwards. And we largely got complacent because of the successes of the Green Revolution in expanding agricultural output per capita. I think an awful lot of government agencies and philanthropies began to think we've got that problem solved rather than recognizing it's an ongoing maintenance problem. So that's the first problem of complacency. And the predictable consequence of reduced investment is slowed supply growth, which any economist is going to tell you sooner or later leads to price rises. So on the left, you see the very long-term series from the 1800s of real food prices in the United States of basic commodities. And you'll notice that, leave out the Depression era, it was essentially flat. We basically had no change in real food prices until the post-World War II era when hybrid maize diffusion and rapid mechanization of America's heartland began to transform agriculture, sharply reduce per unit production costs, and lead to much lower real food prices here and around the world. Now, the right-hand graphic is the most recent period, since 1990, and December 1999, the turn of the millennium, right as all of us were panicking about Y2K, global real food prices hit their all-time low. Since then, they've come up steadily. So if you can read the little print in the box on that right-hand graphic, we're at roughly 40% higher real food prices in the decade that just closed than we were in 2 decades earlier. So, and also much more volatile, as you can see from the series. Many of you remember the price spikes of 2008 and 2011. So if you stop investing in productivity growth and demand growth continues, indeed accelerates because you have income plus population growth, sooner or later prices are going to go up, and indeed they have. And they will continue to, so long as we rely on the same technologies. There's hope coming, though, as I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But most of the predictions coming from models that rely entirely on thinking about the existing stock of land, the existing stock of agricultural technologies, predict that food prices will continue to climb, slowly, but continue to climb in inflation-adjusted terms. So that's problem one, because poor people can't afford expensive food. There are also unintended consequences of that nice story of progress over 50 years. One is that the focus was on staple grains. So the productivity growth in staple cereals meant that the relative prices of more nutritious foods, fruits, vegetables, nuts, rose relative to cheap foods, rice, wheat, maize. And any good economic student will tell you that relative prices matter. People substitute towards things that are cheaper. So we've indeed seen that substitution in diets towards cheaper calories that provide less in the way of minerals and vitamins per dollar spent. You have a graphic here that shows this process in Pakistan. Second problem, closely related, by providing very cheap feedstock, I refer to agricultural products as feedstock for the food system for reasons I'll explain in just a minute. The cheaper agricultural feedstock coming from staple cereals promotes the rise of processed foods and ultra-processed foods. There's also a just natural demand stimulus. As incomes grow, we all want and we all pay for more food. But we're paying a lot more per nutrient we receive because we increasingly pay for things other than the minerals, vitamins, fats, proteins, and calories. We're paying for packaging. We're paying for processing. We're paying for someone to serve it to us at a table. We increasingly are paying for its environmental attributes and its social attributes and its health attributes. So all of these non-nutritive parts consume an ever-increasing share of the consumer food expenditure dollar. But that feedstock, as people are looking for more processing, and the processing becomes the core of what we're actually paying for, the nature of processing matters. And we, until recent years, haven't frankly paid much attention to this, and it's taking a toll on us in terms of health. We think of obesity as a problem affecting the rich, that it's in wealthy communities, or at least comfortable communities like most of the high-income world enjoys, where we see obesity. But in fact, today, obesity is primarily a problem affecting the middle-income world. This new report from the World Bank earlier this year has this really stunning graphic that more than 70% of adults and almost 80% of young children who are obese in the world live in middle-income countries. Not here in the United States or in Canada or some other place where you imagine we're just paying for lots of frivolous, luxurious, sugar-laden food. This is primarily a problem afflicting low and middle-income households, and it is primarily because the food is cheap. The cheapest way to satisfy hunger pangs in a child is to give them cheap, relatively empty calories. And that's a natural consequence of a dedication to staple cereals, productivity growth, at the exclusion of growing more nutritious food supplies. Another consequence is cheaper food makes it easier to dispose of it, or not to care much about how much we lose or how much we waste. And as supply chains get longer, as we release labor from fields and rural areas and people migrate to cities, longer supply chains increase food loss and waste as well. The result is the leakage in the system of essential minerals and vitamins is even greater. So it is much easier to lose vitamins that degrade over time naturally than it is to lose calories or it is to lose minerals. Here you see a graphic of a rather chilling story of zinc loss. So this shows that we produce on average about 4 times the amount of zinc that is needed to give everyone adequate dietary intake of zinc any given day. But by the time we get to final consumption into people's mouths, we only have a margin of like 20, 30%, which when you think about it carefully is nowhere near enough to ensure adequate zinc intake for everybody given maldistribution, given that we can't possibly ensure everybody gets the same amount. And the story is worse, by the way, for things like calcium or folates. Folates should really trouble you if you think about neural tube defects for young children. Women of childbearing age who aren't getting adequate folic acid run real risks for their children and therefore for themselves and their families. So this is a consequence. There are lots of things that go into it, but this is a predictable consequence of a focus on we have to grow the pile of rice. That by not paying attention to a broader problem, we unintentionally created a different problem. This is just how it all happens. Complex systems are like that. We've also overtaxed an awful lot of natural resources. I'm always struck by this graphic in the middle that shows the time path of global water withdrawals across agriculture in blue, industry in red, and municipalities, meaning residential use, in green. People often think of, oh, well, the problem with water use is all the city growth and everybody's watering their lawns. Sure, that probably doesn't help at the margin, but the core of water use globally, 70% of its fresh water is used in agriculture. So we can't double the food supply and double 70%. That's, unless somebody's got some really creative math findings here at Stanford, I don't think that works. And the problem is most acute in the places we can least afford it. So Africa and Asia, water withdrawals for agriculture more than 80%. Here you see a map of the basins, the river basins where this is a problem, red being the most acute problems, orange and yellow being pretty serious problems. And as you can see, besides California and the western part of the United States that some of you may have immediately looked for, it's Africa and Asia where most of these problems are. So water challenges are looming very large, as are soil challenges. The graphic on the right shows the relationship between soil nutrient fluxes in nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, kind of the 3 main nutrients people try to address through chemical fertilizer applications, plotted against log of GDP, of income, of economic output at national scale across sub-Saharan African countries, you can see there's a not super strong, but a positive and statistically significant association between those two. But almost every country observation is below zero, that we're drawing down the soils across sub-Saharan Africa and have been for 30-some years. We have to pay attention to maintaining soils and water much better than we have been during this year of almost exclusive focus on increasing the pile of rice for consumers. So what now? The challenges are different. The first thing to recognize is undernutrition is a real problem still today. But I argue it is not a problem of the food system. It is a problem of two things, first and foremost. First is ultra-poverty manifests most acutely in poverty traps. The graphic on the left shows you what's happened in the world over the last generation to those living at half of the World Bank's poverty line, what some of us term the ultra-poverty line. 95 cents US in 2011 dollars a day per person. 95 cents a day per person. Even inflate it for price changes since 2011, that should strike you as a ridiculously low amount. The hopeful part of that story is globally, we've cut by roughly 2/3 the number of people living beneath that ridiculously low standard. The bad news is, in sub-Saharan Africa, the number's actually grown. The prevalence has fallen, as depicted on the vertical axis. The red balls show you the change in the head count rate, the proportion of the population beneath that line. But the size of the balls, which are scaled for the population, have actually risen slightly. Today, 7 out of 8 of the ultra-poor are in sub-Saharan Africa. That's why we need to focus much more intently on the problems that confront us in Africa. That is where the ultra-poverty problem is pervasive. So there's lots of severe poverty in Asia, especially South Asia. But this problem is becoming particularly concentrated in space in sub-Saharan Africa. And the challenge is around the complex multifactorial causes of poverty traps. That's a completely different lecture or a different book, a book that came out last year. That's not really a food systems problem. There are some food systems pieces to it, but it's primarily a problem of economic and social policy to tackle complex ultra-poverty, to unlock poverty traps. The second problem is conflict. So today, about 80% of stunted children live in conflict-affected zones. The central problem of undernutrition is bullets. It's conflict. It's violence that makes children unsafe, makes it unsafe for their parents to be able to take care of them, or often they've lost parents. It makes it unsafe for the commercial distribution systems that can otherwise reliably provide low-cost, diverse foods, cannot reach their communities effectively. And most especially, it displaces them. So my mother was a war refugee from the Netherlands during World War II. I have some distant appreciation for the challenges refugees faced. I'm incredibly lucky. Today we face a scale of displaced persons that's like what happened during World War II. We're above 70 million people displaced, pushed out of their homes forcibly by violence. And that is the core population. They and those who depend on them are the core population that suffers the most egregious forms of undernutrition in the world today. One of the challenges is, as Marshall and others' work shows, climate change is not going to make this any easier. Climate and conflict are related, folks. Whether it is street violence or it is outright interstate conflict, they are related. There are a range of plots here from one of Marshall's papers and another very nice paper. And that means that we need to tackle undernutrition, but we don't tackle it through agricultural R&D or improving the commercial distribution system or improve formulations for processed foods. It's ultimately about humanitarian response, government commitment to unlocking poverty traps, and to conflict resolution. So I argue that of the triple nutritional burden, the undernutrition problem on which we focused food security challenges 50 years ago is no longer a challenge for the food system and its primary actors. That is now principally the task of humanitarian actors and those who deal with conflict resolution. So the challenges that we can tackle successfully around food security are around these other 6. I've already mentioned Africa. The concentration of ultra poverty there is one reason, but maybe the most fundamental reason is that the vast majority of the population growth in the world over the next 50 years will be taking place in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, the fertility rates in sub-Saharan Africa and the current demographic profile, where the median age is still in the teens, so most Africans are still looking ahead to their childbearing years, means inevitably that the mouths to fill are going to be increasing disproportionately in sub-Saharan Africa. So we have to focus there, quite apart from income growth, which just compounds that, and urbanization, which compounds it further, because Africa is presently the least urbanized continent in the world, but is urbanizing very rapidly. So here you see the UN's population projections with all the different scenarios, and you can see the breakdown of what population projections are for 50 years from now. The takeaway here is populations are going to still be growing in Africa, and by that time, Africa will be almost the size of Asian populations today. Second reason that we have to focus on Africa is we can't use this silly mantra, America feeds the world. I am in a college of agriculture at Cornell. I'm a huge fan of farmers. My grandfather was an egg farmer after he left the Netherlands, here in California, as it happens. But farmers feed the populations of their own countries. That is one of the fundamental truths of food systems. 70 to 80% of the world's food is consumed in the same country in which the feedstock was produced. Food is an incredibly important element of global trade, and trade is essential to stabilize prices. I'm a big proponent of liberalizing agricultural trade restrictions, subject to sensible provisions around safety, et cetera. But the reason for that is price stabilization. It's not that you can count on feeding a population off of imported food all the time, unless you're a small city-state. Singapore can do it. Very few other places can. So if most of the mouths, the additional mouths we're going to have to feed in the world in 50 years are going to be emerging in Africa, we better be starting to develop the capacity to produce the feedstock to feed them in Africa as well. That's a really basic, fundamental piece of economic geography. The other thing is there's a lot of opportunity. Productivity of agriculture in Africa and in parts of Asia are much lower than they are in the rest of the world. This is a diagram that shows on the horizontal axis agricultural output per worker, on the vertical axis agricultural output per hectare, per unit land. And so the further out you are, kind of in the upper right corner, you're the most productive on Earth. And it's not that one spot on the frontier is better than another. It all just depends upon availability and cost of labor and land. But as you would expect, Canada, the United States, Oceania, so Australia, Europe, Japan, Korea, they're the pace setters. These are the most productive agricultural economies in the world. You see in the big red circle, I've drawn the trajectories for sub-Saharan Africa, which falls in the lowest left of these squiggly lines that trace out the path of progression in land and labor productivity in agriculture over the 45 years from 61 to 2015. And then you can see most of the Asian regions, the developing Asian regions there too. So they're quite a long way from the global frontier. There's a lot of opportunity here to boost productivity, and there's a need to do it because you have to boost productivity because that's where the emergent demand will be. So we have to focus much more tightly on Africa than we have been. South Asia secondarily. Second key part is a focus on healthy diets, not on hunger and staple cereals. And my colleagues in the CGIAR get angry with me as they hear me say this routinely, but it needs to be said loudly and frequently. We need to keep growing productivity in rice and wheat and corn, absolutely. They're essential commodities and they're the base of an awful lot of diets around the world. But we need to grow even faster the productivity of other commodities. We have seen hunger come down. We've seen the number of people we feed adequately with dietary energy increase rapidly, 90 million a year for 50 years. We have not seen the same trajectory in iron deficiency anemia, or anemia more broadly, both iron and B12 deficiency. we have a growing number of people suffering anemia, disproportionately children and women of childbearing age. We see a distressing number of school-aged children suffering vitamin A deficiency. These are all things that are easily correctable with decent diets and with properly fortified foods. Zinc deficiency prevalence, we have a hard time even pinning down, but it's crazy high in Asia and Africa. I doubt any of you have ever thought about a zinc deficiency problem in your families, but this is a pervasive problem across much of the low-income world. While 800 plus million people not getting enough dietary energy any given night is a problem, the problem is 3 or 4-fold bigger when we think about minerals and vitamins, people not getting enough. So I would argue that's probably where we should focus first. Obesity is catching up, by the way. So obesity is a much bigger problem also than undernutrition now, but not nearly as big as micronutrient deficiency, and closely related in that they both are intimately involved with healthy diets. So one approach to this, advocated by a fellow named Pedro Sanchez in a piece published earlier this month in Food Policy, where he makes the case for needing to reallocate existing farmland. And with caveat that these are incredibly simplistic back-of-the-envelope calculations. You shouldn't take these too seriously. But the first order finding Pedro has is that if we just took a diet recommended, controversial diet, I would add, but a diet recommended by a bunch of nutritionists, published in Lancet last year, the Eat Lancet Commission, and you take that diet, you project it across all the world's population as projected in 2050, and you take current agricultural productivity across all commodities, and you just see with the current land allocation, where would we be in terms of the availability of essential nutrients and the different crops grown. What you come away with at the very bottom is that we don't actually need any more land and cultivation. We could produce the Eat Lancet diet using today's productivity, no growth in yields, if we just reallocated land away from the commodities that you see in surpluses in black and towards the ones that you see in deficit in red, so that if we simply were able to reallocate land towards healthier, more nutritious foods, we could close an awful lot of the dietary availability gap right away without even requiring technological change. Again, this is an extremely simplistic analysis. Pedro would be the first to tell you, don't go bet money on this particular table. But the takeaway here is we can do a lot simply by changing incentives to induce land reallocation across different commodities. And one reason why that's important is that micronutrient deficiencies don't just fall with income growth the way dietary energy intake does. We feel hunger pangs, and one of the first things we do if we have money in our pocket when our stomach tells us I'm hungry is we go buy food. But you don't feel vitamin A deficiency, and you don't feel iodine deficiency, so we don't have the same very natural biochemical impulse to satisfy that need because we simply don't have a system that picks up on that need quickly enough. So we see that the income elasticities, to use the economic jargon, of intake for minerals and vitamins are much lower than they are for macronutrients. And we can't therefore count on economic growth alone to solve this problem. We really do have to engineer things in the food system to address it. Part of it might be land reallocation, but part of it has to happen in the nature of the foods we produce. And a colleague of mine at Cornell, Mike Gore, a plant breeder, I love this graphic of his. This is entirely his with some help from one of his colleagues. He says there are 4 pieces of the puzzle, and you can't solve this problem without all 4 pieces. One of which, the natural one that we've all told our children is, eat a healthy diet. So dietary diversity, fruits and vegetables being a centerpiece of that, that's obviously part of the story. But in many cases, you also need to supplement. So women who are pregnant are commonly taking vitamin supplements for a very important reason. That's a really good precaution to take. Commercial fortification is essential. Neural tube defects in this country fell precipitously as soon as it became imperative regulatory requirement to fortify flour with folic acid. And iodine deficiency and cretinism fell precipitously in this country as soon as we began to iodize salt. Strangely, the United States, not most countries make it a legal requirement to iodize salt. In the United States, it's not a legal requirement, but salt manufacturers have figured out it's a smart thing to do. It's low cost, and getting enough iodine into people is a good thing. So commercial fortification after the farm gate. The most recent innovation is around biofortification, as it's called, just changing the genetic material of a plant so that it now makes more available iron or provitamin A. So the World Food Prize a couple of years ago was awarded to a team that developed orange fleshy sweet potato that can appreciably increase beta-carotene intake and thereby reduce vitamin A deficiencies in rural populations in Africa and Asia. So biofortification is a big deal in the plant breeding community and the nutrition community. It's not a magic bullet, but it's a part. It's one piece of the puzzle that we need. So some of this is going to be upstream, biofortified seeds, improved chemical mixes that make available minerals that are otherwise deficient in local soils or dissolving. For example, there have been some interesting experiments dissolving little bits of iodine irrigation water that gets taken up by crops and can take care of problems in communities that don't get enough iodized salt. Some of it's midstream around industrial fortification, and some of it's at the consumer end, dietary choice, consumer behavior change. But we need to focus the food system much more around healthy diets. We can do that through conventional policy instruments, taxes and subsidies. As some of you are aware, because this has been happening in the Bay Area, sugar-sweetened beverages have been a target. I still have not quite figured out why we restrict it to sugar-sweetened beverages when most of the sugar people take in is coming from other dietary sources. But it's a place to start. I understand that Pepsi and Coke are natural targets for people. These are taking off around the world, and the evidence that's beginning to roll in is showing that they really seem to be fairly effective in reducing intake. And in the couple of studies that kind of sort of maybe draw credible associations with health outcomes in reducing non-communicable diseases associated with excessive sugar intake, things like diabetes. Another big thing we need to focus on much more is de-risking. The world is growing ever more risky. The climate crisis is one of the obvious ones. Right now, we're acutely aware of infectious disease transmission, trade wars that we are still in the midst of. The risks are looming larger today, and it's not clear that we should anticipate they will subside anytime soon. This is where technology is incredibly important. Some of this is genetic technology, really exciting things plant breeders do in developing drought or flood-resistant varieties of crops, disease-resistant varieties of crops and animals both. Some really exciting work underway converting the photosynthetic pathway of rice, a C3 grass, so that it behaves like corn, a C4 grass. It can basically become a lot more productive when there's more sunlight and it's hotter. Gene editing technologies offer lots of promise and a fair amount of risk, very controversial for a variety of reasons. There are tons of digital technologies coming online, much of it from this particular part of the world, that accelerate price discovery so that farmers or fishermen, in a famous study done off the coast of India, or done in India, fishermen who were off the coast of Kerala could simply use their cell phone to find out what's the landed price of fish in different ports over a fairly narrow range of coastline, and thereby find the place that would give them the best price for a highly perishable product. So this increased their incomes dramatically and thereby helped their families to eat a much healthier diet. So that's a really simple digital technology. The banking system in Kenya has been completely transformed by an app, a money app called M-Pesa, that is contributing dramatically to people being able to buffer one another against things that happen to their families. But it's also technologies that feed into farming. Precision agriculture is a very big thing. People like David and Marshall are very heavily involved in harnessing the power that comes from our ability through satellites to look at increasingly precise spots on Earth and figure out exactly what's going on and what those patterns mean for farmers, for traders, for humanitarian response agencies. These technologies are potentially very powerful as we try to de-risk, we try to manage these various shocks. And there are also various mechanical technologies out there, not least of which simple things like better bags for storing crops. It's amazing how much bang you get for the buck with a pretty simple bag to store your sorghum in. De-risking requires markets and institutions, though. It's not just about technologies. You have to be able to set up, for example, I've been heavily involved in a program to develop drought insurance for pastoralists, for herders in dry lands in the Horn of Africa in southern Ethiopia, northern Kenya. They suffer catastrophic herd losses pretty regularly during droughts, and then they would sit and wait for months until the food aid shipments would arrive. So we could use modern technologies, satellite technologies, to predict herd losses, turn these into insurance contracts, literally put options. But we could take the drought risk in the Horn of Africa and push it out into the global capital market. So when drought would happen, you'd have Swiss reinsurance companies paying out to farmers in Africa who otherwise wouldn't be getting anything. And demonstrably that improves their standards of living and at a very cost-effective level. But if you want to pursue a technology like that, you have to have really careful regulatory apparatus, because that same product could equally be a lottery ticket. And selling lottery tickets to the poor is not something we should be championing. Providing insurance products for them that really work is something we should champion. But knowing which is which requires fairly careful quality control. We need the quality control mechanisms in place. The technologies have outstripped the emergence of appropriate regulatory apparatus, I would argue, as someone who's been responsible for developing one of those products. But it's also things like markets. Actually, one of your graduates, Eleni, was your student here, wasn't she, Marcel? So on that lower graphic there is the board from the Ethiopia Commodities Exchange. I took that picture at a dusty town in southern Ethiopia, providing near real-time updates of the current prices for, I can't read the Amharic, forgive me. Actually, it's Oromifa, not even Amharic, so I'm even worse at it. But it's giving real-time updates to farmers so they can make sensible decisions over where are prices going, what should I be doing? Should I sell? Should I hold? Should I plant more teff? Should I plant more maize? Should I give up on all of it? So again, this requires an institution. It wasn't really around the technology. The technology was important, but the cleverness of a Stanford graduate in figuring out, I can build a commodities exchange in Ethiopia that can help to de-risk an awful lot for small growers around this country, that goes pretty far. The next and most controversial thing perhaps most controversial thing I want to say is about de-agrarianizing the food system. By that I mean the following, that other than being a mouthful, de-agrarianization is increasingly detaching the food that we consume from the land on which feedstock is commonly grown. So we have this image in our head that all of our food is grown on some plot of a farm. That is not actually how you spend your money. So 86 cents on the dollar in the United States is accruing to actors post-Farmgate. So put differently, for every dollar you spend on food, only about 14 cents of it actually goes back to farms. The vast majority of what you're paying for is processing, it's transport, it's insurance, it's restaurants, it's fancy supermarkets, it's all kinds of other stuff. And a lot of it is the add-ons because we feel good that we're paying for fair trade coffee or that this tuna fish is dolphin safe, whatever that particularly means. But that labeling boosts the price that we're willing to pay. So we see steadily these graphs show you plots of what happens over time on the left in the United States to the cents per consumer food dollar that accrues to farmers. So from 1947, when almost half of the consumer food expenditure went to farmers, to today, and there are two different series here because USDA changed the way it computes this. Today, it's about 14 cents. So you've seen this steady decline. And that's not just the United States. On the right, work that we're just about to publish shows across 61 different middle to high income countries that represent about a little more than 90% of the global economy. You see the same pattern that as incomes grow, the share of consumer food expenditure that goes to farmers just steadily falls. So the system naturally de-agrarianizes in the sense of most of what we're paying for is not actually the land and the owner and operator of the land, it's all the stuff that happens afterwards. And that's happening in part today because we value environmental attributes and health attributes. It's not just the packaging and processing that kind of took place more in the middle income region. So that's one part of de-agrarianization, is focus beyond the farm gate. That's where the ultra-processing that risks our health happens. That's where an awful lot of the greenhouse gas emissions and pollution of water and other things takes place. But the other part of de-agrarianization is the next generation of production technologies that are happening off the farm, particularly in this area. You have a rather large plant-based and cellular alternatives to meat industry emerging in Northern California. For those of you who don't know, Impossible Foods is one town over. Finless Foods is just right across the bay. These new emergent technologies are seeing costs fall really fast. And the basic reasons for that are, one, the increased real prices of food we saw as a natural consequence of reduced ag R&D that I showed you earlier. As food prices get high, you notice these guys aren't going for, let me see if I can develop a really good substitute for Cheerios. It's not worth it. There's not a margin there to make money off of. But when you're talking about substitutes for meats, when you're talking about substitute for tuna, these are high-priced products now, and if you can come up with a cost-effective way of replicating the basic taste, texture, and nutrient structure of that food product, you can make money. And they're trying hard to do that. It seems like a new startup comes out of stealth mode about every month right now in this space. And the cost curves seem to be coming down pretty fast. This is from a report done by a San Francisco-based think tank, RethinkX, where they estimate the cost per kilogram of beef for traditional production in blue, in light blue, for precision fermentation, plant-based foods. So put in a fermenter, glucose or some other mechanism, and just get bacteria to produce the proteins you want. And in black cell-based beef, so you culture from tissue. So you grow your own steak. It's not a steak substitute. It's a real steak, just never had a cow attached to it. So these are their estimates of how the cost curves are going. I'm not endorsing their estimates, but directionally, they're almost certainly correct. The costs are coming down fast. You see this if you go to Dunkin' Donuts or White Castle or Burger King or any other place, most of the cafeterias here on Stanford's campus that offer plant-based burgers or offer any of a variety of these substitute products. These costs are coming down fast. And that means that the production of the feedstock that goes into our food system will increasingly be generated off the farm, separated from the land. This is not surprising. 100 years ago, we were substituting capital for labor because people's time was becoming too valuable to keep it occupied in corn and wheat fields and in dairy farms. So we developed milking parlors, and we developed mechanical reapers and combines and all the rest of it. And land remained, but labor was displaced. Today, we're starting to see the substitution of capital for land. We're at the very earliest stages of this, but it's happening, and it's not going to reverse direction. And one of the reasons is we're increasingly willing to pay for the environmental attributes of food. It's that de-agrarianization of consumer demand for food. That we are increasingly willing to pay for an Impossible Burger that has a much lower climate footprint, far lower greenhouse gas emissions than the equivalent burger that came through the traditional system. You and I are paying for that. Many people quite consciously. That's probably a big share of the market right now, are environmentally conscious consumers, or some who are health conscious and feel that that's likely to improve their health. I think that's more disputable than the climate gains from some of these methods. But as that share of population willing to pay for these things grows, and these are very large fixed cost economy of scale operations, the unit costs will continue to fall. That's the basic driver of these cost curves you see. And as that happens, we have a couple of options. One, we can sit by and do virtually nothing. And as we develop complete replacements for dairy-based casein, a byproduct that actually fills the gap between dairy farmers losing money consistently and breaking even or making money, and replacing casein in the industrial food production system so we no longer need dairy-based casein is not very far away. We can watch that happen, and with it see dairy farms collapse, all the row crop producers, the soy and corn producers generating feed for those dairy farms go under too, farmland values collapse. You now have a rural banking crisis in the Midwest. Rural poverty just grows further, accentuating what's already an increasing rural-urban divide in the United States in poverty rates. We can watch that happen, and that will replicate outside the United States. We're just the canary in the coal mine. We're the first one to have it happen to us. Or we can try to get ahead of this. And I would argue that given that the world spends $1 million a minute right now on farm support programs, we have more than $700 billion a year spent on farm support programs, we could afford to maybe redirect some of that into helping smooth transitions so that farmers move from farming dairy cattle and soy to farming carbon and methane and solar and wind. We're starting to see that emerge. My wife and I drove from Ithaca to Stanford in January, and I was really amazed to see how many wind turbines, solar panels we saw across the Midwest. Very spotty. Some places have clearly embraced this, other places not at all. Other places, you see a biodigester in the background of a dairy herd here, where they're capturing methane they sell into the grid. These are ways in which we can turn farming from being a source of climate problems, about a quarter of the world's greenhouse gas emissions come from agricultural production, to a source of climate solutions, producing the alternative renewable energies that displace the need for fossil-based fuels, and at the same time, sequestering carbon from the atmosphere through deep soil sequestration or trees or other sorts of ways of capturing carbon and keeping it on the ground. But that de-agrarianization is happening only in very patchy ways. And this is where policies and institutions could really matter. Institutions, things like how we regulate the production of electricity. Nebraska is almost devoid of wind turbines. Nebraska is the windiest state in the US. The reason is all caught up in regulation around power generation. So this is a regulatory problem for the lack of emergence of wind turbines in Nebraska, as best as I can tell. So the technologies exist, the price points are coming down. Farmers could transition as we naturally de-agrarianize the food system anyway, and we could have a nice smooth transition with rural communities benefiting and helping the planet at the same time. We need to start focusing on this. This is going to be a real thing. Part of that is respecting planetary boundaries. I've actually already talked about all of this, so I can skip through it. But there are a lot of technologies emerging there, much of it really small-scale stuff. I've got some colleagues at Cornell working on village-scale pyrolysis, where you can take crop residues, put it into a kiln, pyrolyze it, precipitate it out, biochar, a really carbon-dense soil nutrient, so use it as a fertilizer, and at the same time get a liquid combustible gas to run an engine so that you now have transport fuel available. All of this off-grid. You don't need to bring in the transport fuels from some petroleum-producing country, and you don't need to import all the fertilizers. You produce it locally using crop residues. It seems to work. Technologically, it works. There's still some economic and management issues. Or equivalently, in Ethiopia, they're working on taking the bones from animal carcasses. Ethiopia is the largest livestock herd in Africa. You walk around towns in Ethiopia, you find piles of bones of rotting carcasses outside butchers and restaurants. It's a public health hazard with all kinds of vectors enjoying these rotting carcasses. But you take the bones from that, and my colleagues have run an experiment paying people nominal amounts. People are going through the garbage anyway to try to collect things, paying them to harvest bones and bring them in, where they pyrolyze them in a kiln, precipitate out phosphorus-rich fertilizer. It's like triple superphosphate. It's agronomically identical impacts as TSP. Ethiopia spends about $300 million a year importing phosphate fertilizers. You could get it just by harvesting out of the garbage, the carcasses that are repository for an awful lot of phosphorus. And in a really simple drum, that top thing is the simple kiln that they built in Jima to do this. It's doable. We can scale these technologies, and there are lots of others. Improve biocontrols. BT eggplant in Bangladesh is a favorite of one of my colleagues at Cornell. I guess I just want to wrap up by emphasizing, as much as I've tried to talk about science and technology as a really central piece of the progress that we can enjoy going forward, where we can ensure all people at all times have access to healthy diets, it's ultimately going to come down to what are we willing to do as a society? What policies, institutions, regulations will we adopt? Personally, my deepest concerns are around intellectual property. The prior generation of the Green Revolution was based heavily on public and philanthropic investment in R&D that was publicly available. It wasn't licensed for royalties commercially by the owners, by the inventors of the technologies. It was put in the public domain to be used freely by all national agricultural research and extension systems and by for-profit companies. So the genesis of the commercial plant advances in the United States have their roots almost entirely in lines developed within the international agricultural research system in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. So now those have been added to by commercial firms and held under private commercial intellectual property. If we continue down this path with the discoveries coming forward, we're going to have a problem of capture, of elite capture of what is essentially a public trust. We all stand on the shoulder of giants. The advances we're making in science and technology right now have many of their origins in the discoveries made in places like Stanford or Cornell using public resources. We need to find a way to ensure that there are incentives for entrepreneurs to invest, to take risks, but that we ensure everybody stands to benefit from it. In particular, poorer people stand to benefit from it. I also have a lot of concerns about rather mindless opposition to transgenic or gene editing technologies. There's thoughtful opposition to it. Let me be clear. It's not that, Dave and I were talking about this on the walk over. It's not that you should always just say whatever the chemical companies came up with, let's go for that. But just the automatic rejection that we're seeing in some quarters right now is incredibly unproductive. To me, the poster child for this was in the early 2000s, massive drought in southern Africa. We had about 10 million people suffering from pretty acute malnutrition, and the United States government is willing to ship in significant volumes of maize, the staple commodity for people in Zambia in particular. The Zambian government refuses to accept U.S. maize because U.S. corn was overwhelmingly genetically modified, and there was no credible way for guaranteeing that you were getting non-GM maize. We just don't have good enough segregation of GM and non-GM strains. So the Zambian government refused to accept it, even when the South African government volunteered to mill all the maize so you couldn't possibly plant the grains. You can plant flour, it just doesn't grow very well. So this was now purely a food being made available, and the Zambian government, under enormous pressure from multiple European governments, said on health grounds, we will not distribute U.S. food aid. Starvation has health consequences. This was the most ridiculous case of mindless opposition to transgenics I can think of. Thankfully, we haven't repeated that sad episode, but we have milder versions of it still flaring up fairly regularly. We need to promote scientific literacy. There are good reasons to worry about some transgenics, and there are some good reasons to worry about some approaches to gene editing. But just blanket condemnations of it are unhelpful for everybody, and most unhelpful for the poorest people who don't have voices in those debates and who suffer the real consequences of food systems when they fail. So just to recap, I think we've got real challenges ahead of us, but we also have a lot of promise ahead of us. Ultimately, I'm very optimistic because we've seen a challenge like this before, we faced it, and we prevailed. But the key was defining the challenge. And the challenge defined 50 years ago, we need to grow the pile of rice before the world's food consumers, is not the challenge we face today. So the likelihood that we can succeed in innovating to address global food security challenges really is going to be a function of how quickly we can reorient around what the real challenges are today, around de-risking the system, de-agrarianizing the system, focusing on Africa and to a lesser degree South Asia, and focusing on healthy diets. If we can do that, if we can shift focus and we can reinvest and get the institutional and policy underpinnings in place, I think we'll be in pretty good shape. But it's going to take a lot of work, especially you students. You have a lot of exciting things to do and some important tasks ahead of you. It's going to be long after I'm done. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, it's too bad he didn't give you anything to really provoke you to ask questions, but I'll give you a couple minutes to think about that as I kind of start us off. And again, I'll look for students to start us off just to warn you. Well, thanks very much, and I'll give you a second to get a drink while I ask the question. And I guess first I just wanted to kind of clarify what you're saying. In particular, kind of connecting the de-agrarianization part to the the first part where you talk about demand growth and most forecasts being for demand growth to be significant and especially in developing countries to exceed supply growth. To clarify, are you saying that the dairy farms going under in the U.S. is the canary in the coal mine in terms of supply starting to rapidly outpace demand, and that's really the problem we should be worrying about, not demand outpacing supply, even in, say, Africa?
Yeah, great question. Yes, so the models that we presently rely on to predict what are the trajectories for real food prices going forward are all based off of present production patterns and technologies. None of those models incorporates alt meat. None of them incorporate plant-based or cellular alternatives to present production systems. So we need to recognize that really fundamental shortcoming of the modeling apparatus we work with right now. By the way, that's not meant as a critique of those models. You calibrate a model off of data, and there is no data available on those systems because they're so new. But you've rightly identified an inconsistency that these models are all telling us food prices are going to continue to go up. But most economists' natural reaction to that is when prices go up, people are going to come in to meet that added demand with new supply. And that's what's happening. It's just coming in a new form. It's not coming through expansion of area cultivated. It's not coming through accelerated productivity growth in traditional crops or traditional livestock systems. It's coming through a whole new system. And that is a canary in the coal mine. And one of the risks we see right now is growing opposition. I think right now, there are 18 states that have either enacted or are considering legislation regarding the labeling of the products that come from plant-based and cellular alternatives to meat-based proteins. Banning the use of the term meat, that you can't call it a burger, for example. Let's be clear about what's happening here. This is partly making sure consumers understand what they're buying. Partly it's about throwing up chaff in the face of an industry making progress. The former is something we should applaud. It's good to make sure we all understand what we're paying for. The latter is something that should concern us. When you're just kind of having a Luddite response trying to obstruct people who are making progress, there are other ways to channel this. And I do think that dairy farms going under, the price of casein, are going to be pretty leading indicators for us of, are we really seeing this transformation happening at scale in a way that's changing the food system?
And so you're thinking on the timescales of a decade that these technologies are going to be appropriate and adopted enough in Africa, say, or in South Asia?
It's going to be leading here. The opportunity for fermentation-based technologies in particular, cellular is going to be further off, but impossible foods beyond meat type products, the opportunities for those in sub-Saharan Africa are increasingly good. Mm-hmm. We're getting a sufficiently reliable electricity grid in parts of Africa with reasonably good internet access. In several countries, a pretty significant population of young, scientifically literate folks who can work in a high-tech industry. And infrastructure is terrible. So if you can move production into a concentrated area, and there's increasingly available capital. There are quite a few emerging billionaires in Africa eager to invest in the food sector there. You can easily imagine developing a precision fermentation hub around Nairobi, around Lagos, around Addis Ababa. I would not at all be surprised to see those within a decade. Mm-hmm. And that's an opportunity to leapfrog, much in the way you don't find landline telephones in Africa today. Or you only do when you go into some government ministries where they were installed in the 1970s and haven't been replaced since. Everybody's on cell phones. They just leapfrog the technology completely. And I wouldn't be surprised to see that happen in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia.
The other question I had as you were talking was just really to take advantage of your encyclopedic knowledge of food security, not anything you mentioned, but a question that students often ask is more domestic about kind of food insecurity in communities in the U.S. Mm-hmm. And I know that's something that you've thought about in the eastern U.S., but what would you identify as the major needs or levers in terms of food insecurity? And is it a concerning, like in terms of the inequality in the country and the trends in terms of whether it's obesity or micronutrient deficiency or even undernutrition.
Yeah, it's interesting that you raised this. My research group just wrote and thankfully won our first grant proposal for work on domestic food security in New York State, in rural New York State, where this is a growing problem. We see a large share of children growing up in households where they can't count on getting healthy meals, 3 healthy meals a day. And the problems are complicated. Their origins are in part the steady decline of rural economies, that there aren't adequate good jobs available in places like 2 counties away from me to support families well. But it's also caught up in the steady decline of our social safety net, which we're seeing much more rapidly deteriorating in the last few years. You know, the most recent rulings around SNAP, around the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, food stamps in popular parlance. You know, we're seeing lots of families being dropped from SNAP, and they just don't have other ways of getting adequate food. There are lots of problems with that system. The food banking system is maturing very rapidly. We happen to be fortunate. The food bank that serves the 6-county region that includes Ithaca, Tompkins County, is one of the more sophisticated ones in the country. So they have a mobile food bank system. They literally bring a truck around that's loaded up with all the food pantry commodities, and they bring it into towns on a regular schedule, and they have an algorithmic approach to figuring out what commodities to put in there, how frequently to go, exactly where to deliver, et cetera, based on the likelihood of meeting people's needs. They're trying to use technology to do a much better job of operating an emergency assistance program. But it should be an emergency assistance program, and increasingly it's a kind of chronic support program. There isn't a simple solution here just yet. Here it seems like the root problem is much more homelessness and the high cost of housing for everybody. Not so much an issue in upstate New York.
All right, why don't we open it up now? We have about 15 minutes or so. I have plenty more questions if you guys are shy, but it usually takes one to get us going, and then students. Yeah, Benji?
Given like the very opposite stances on regulation of like CRISPR and gene edited technologies, say like in Europe versus like the US, particularly under like the Trump administration being like super lax, what would you say is kind of the best method of doing so? With like it's a promising technology, as you said, but like obviously regulation is like pretty crucial. So would you say it's like somewhere in the middle, or like?
He's very clever because he's in my class, and this is the discussion for next week. So he's trying to get you to do his homework here. But go ahead. It's okay.
He's using a transcription technology right now. Huh?
It's okay. It's okay.
For those who don't understand the inside baseball, gene editing technology, commonly people refer to CRISPR, which is the primary one people are using right now, was recently decided by the European Court of Justice, or whatever the proper term is, to be a technology that substantially changes the mutagenesis of a plant so that it has to undergo the same regulatory approval process that transgenics, that more conventional genetically modified foods do. So transgenic meaning you took a gene from one organism and you put it in a different one. So take a gene from a bacterium, you put it into corn, that's BT maize. That is a transgenic. If you just go into the maize genome and turn on and off particular genes within that organism, the European court decided you will treat it the same way as if it's a transgenic. So that's a fairly burdensome regulatory apparatus that will, without question, slow down progress on CRISPR-based or other gene editing-based discoveries around plant and animal genetic improvements in Europe. The United States, by contrast, USDA ruled that there's substantial equivalence, that because you're going into the organism itself and just turning on and off its genes, that you're not substantially changing the organism, and so it does not require any extraordinary approvals process. It goes through the regular FDA approvals process, so it's a much more lax system, so just by way of background. What's the right way to do it? I don't know. What I do know is that you have to start with carefully controlled trials, obviously. But we're seeing that already emerging, and there are both risks that we're seeing emerging, that people think they're turning on a gene, and in fact they turned on a different gene at the same time, inadvertently, but they did. And we should be concerned about that, and we need to have very controlled experiments to find out what's the likelihood of that happening and what might be the consequences. Because once you release it, it's hard to pull it back into the lab. So there are reasons for careful trials, as there are for any other food or drug that goes through basic approvals processes. What's unclear is why we need to apply something like a precautionary principle that has as its root a standard that you have to demonstrate there will be no harm. Proving a null is, as best as I can tell, as somebody who's taught econometrics for a lot of years, extremely difficult to do. We typically reject a null, that we have high confidence that you're not going to see a big effect, but we can't tell you if it's no effect or not. We can just tell you it can't be super far from no with much probability. That's the difference, is what is the root standard we're using? And my concern about the European approach right now is it commonly goes back to a precautionary principle standard that risks making it infeasible to make progress. And if we don't make scientific progress, we will surely fail. I get nervous about deregulation in the United States. I think we're running some risks right now we shouldn't be running. But I think we're probably a little closer to the right approach on gene editing here than Europe is at the moment. I'm hoping they both will start to converge towards the center a bit.
It'll also be, I mean, there's a lot of overlap with the fermentation that you were talking about, and
Yes.
seeing how Europe treats those technologies. There was a question over here.
That was fantastic. Thank you for this conversation today. Given the entrepreneurial horsepower that's probably in the room today, you threw out a few innovations, a few ideas that could be targeted here. Many of folks are focusing on those today. To your point, what are the white spaces where you don't see any activity? For example, like the bovine, microbiome, for the rumen microbiome. Like, what are those white spaces that you just don't see anybody cranking away at?
The high return ones, because things like rumen microbiomes are not heavily occupied, but it's also not clear how much impact we can generate realistically. Water and soils. Those are our big limiting factors right now in land-based production. I mean, leave aside all I was saying about de-agrarianizing the food system. For the foreseeable future, we're going to need to continue to grow the vast majority of the world's feedstock on the land, and that takes water, and we're going to need more food, so we're going to need more water, because most food is water. We need to figure out some pretty clever ways of getting much more efficient in water extraction, storage, and use in agriculture than we are right now. And at the same time, we need to really pay much closer attention to soils, especially in low-income countries. Most genetic improvements in crops are developed for adequately fertile soils. And as soils acidify and lose their organic matter, the response you get from an improved cultivar is lost. You're not, go try to plant improved seed on the beach. It's just not going to grow very well. It doesn't matter how clever the seed is, it's just not going to do well because there's nothing there for the soil to give to the seed. We have not been paying, we treat soil like dirt, is what I often tell my students. We need to pay a lot more attention to how do we get nutrients back into soils. There's some really clever things happening right now, but not at very large scale. In particular, like I'm really intrigued by some efforts right now to use porta-johns, basically, to use portable toilets to harvest waste and extract from it, get rid of all the pathogens, but extract a lot of nutrients that could be returned to the soils in places where that's deficient. In lots of the peri-urban slums and urban slums in Africa, you don't have inside toilets for everybody. So there's a whole industry emerging of providing porta-johns so that people can go have some privacy and so that governments can keep some public health measures under control. That creates an opportunity potentially for some technologies to extract those nutrients and figure out how to put them into the soil cost effectively, because these are also the places that most need the rehabilitation of soils. Those are, not pretty, not sexy. Don't run home to tell your grandmother, hey, I'm in the porta-john business. But but I think there's some technology that can be developed there to like screen for pathogens and to segregate and sort nutrients fast and cheaply that could be very high return.
Maybe over here.
So my question is in regards to the undernourishment and hidden hunger, micronutrient deficiencies. Why do you think that, given the billions of people that are affected by these, we haven't seen a green revolution equivalent for solving this problem as we did for the lack of calories in the 1970s?
Oh, great question. There are multiple things behind it. Part of it is the basic physiological impulse we have that we feel and respond to hunger, we respond to macronutrient deprivation, and we don't respond physiologically to micronutrient deprivation quickly the same way. So there's not the same demand stimulus that comes to help drive it. A second reason, and this is going to sound really bizarre, is geopolitics. The CGIAR that I mentioned, the network of 15 international agricultural research centers, has occasionally considered adding an existing center called the World Vegetable Center, which is seriously under-resourced. It's got a tiny budget. The school I ran had a much bigger budget than the World Vegetable Center. The reason that the World Vegetable Center doesn't join that network and thereby kind of join a club where it has access to much, much better funding is that it's headquartered in Taiwan. It's a pretty big impediment to people bringing on board a Taiwan-based organization. No matter how much good it's doing for the world, the People's Republic of China government is never going to allow that to happen. Geopolitics raises its head in lots of ugly places. There are other reasons too. I mean, varieties of vegetables are incredibly complicated. My breeder friends who work on vegetables tell me, yeah, it's not like maize or rice. And I'm seeing a couple of heads nodding. I suspect there are people here who go through the Burpee catalog about this time of year figuring out what tomato seed they're going to get. And there are tons of them, and it's all adapted to very small micro environments. So that's part of the challenge in general of plant breeding for Africa, by the way, is far more small-scale variation in agroecosystems that mean a variety that works in one place doesn't work very well 50 kilometers away. Where the massive Indo-Gangetic plain, you could come up with semi-dwarf varieties of rice and wheat that would work reasonably homogeneously. It's a lot harder for vegetables, just like it's been a lot harder in Africa. And that's one of the other big challenges.
Yeah, maybe up here in the middle, and then we can go back there.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Very interesting. You argued, if I understood you correctly, that international trade is not the best solution for increasing the food security. What do you think is the role of domestic trade within African countries and trade within or between neighboring countries in Africa?
Hugely important. That's how it happens right now. I mean, if you think about how have food systems changed at very long time scales, they've gone from communities that first domesticated grasses and started raising cereals, who all lived in that community, grew it, harvested it, processed it, ate it, all in the same village and its surrounding fields, to now most population lives at quite some distance in cities. And so now we grow, ship, process, ship again, eat. I'm oversimplifying, but that elongated supply chain means that because populations have urbanized, or at least moved away from farms, including to like towns in rural spaces, there has to be facilitated trade. This is why phone systems are so important and road systems are so important. And the rule of law is so important because you're no longer exchanging with people who you know and see and will always interact with, so you can just kind of enforce through reputation or threatening to beat up their little brother that they pay you. You know, when you're trading with anonymous people at some distance, you need a lot more confidence that agreements will be honored. Marcel wrote a very nice book on this very topic of kind of how markets actually operate, and they change over time as economic development takes place. The trading systems in much of Africa have been evolving really, really fast, as they have in South Asia. and they're hugely heterogeneous. There are places in Africa where it's identical to the United States. I mean, you have these big hypermarkets with very sophisticated supply chains going to nearby areas that have good soils and water, and farmers who are on their cell phones talking with the buyers. It's not a whole lot different than here. But then you go another couple 100 kilometers up country, and you're in a radically different place. And it's integrating that, it's stretching out further into the hinterland that has happened in Europe and most of North America, not all of North America, that it has yet to really take place in Africa and parts of South Asia. And a lot of it's just government capacity, both financial capacity to build roads and provide police protection and all those sorts of things, as well as institutional capacity, a willingness to kind of abide by a rule of law and to continuously invest in maintaining a public infrastructure. Hasn't always been a priority in countries that focus mainly on, will city folk riot, and they don't worry as much about what happens in rural areas.
I see a lot of hands up, and unfortunately I think we're ready to transition. So I encourage you to allow Chris to go to the reception and then tackle him over there. But as I told you, he is very skilled in cross-checking, so just be careful when you do that.
I'm also around until late March. So.
And he is around, I should say that. But yes, please join me in thanking Chris again for a great presentation.